There comes a time in life when the noise of the world begins to tire you in a way that no one understands. It's not boredom, it's overflow. You've seen too much, felt too much, understood too much, and now all you want is silence. Carl Jung said that when consciousness awakens, external noise becomes interference. The mind no longer supports shallow conversations, and the heart no longer feeds on what is common. It is the self calling you inward with the soft and firm voice of someone who has always waited for this encounter. Loneliness then ceases to be a punishment and becomes a refuge. You begin to realize that being alone is the price of lucidity, and that silence, far from being empty, is the cradle where the soul finally breathes. In this space, spirituality ceases to be theory and becomes listening. Listening to the body, the emotions, the voices that come from the unconscious. There is no enlightenment without recollection, and there is no recollection without courage. The courage to shed what the world taught you to be, to rediscover who you always were. The path of the awakened is lonely, but not too lonely. Because deep within that silence, there is a presence that has never left you, O self. He is the one who observes your pain, protects you from excess, and guides you back home. And if you've come this far, it's because you've already heard the call, even if it's in whispers. This is the beginning of the journey, understanding why silence is not the absence of life, but the fertile soil where the spirit flourishes. There comes a moment in life when the noise of the world stops entertaining and starts to hurt. It's not that the sound changes, it's that something inside you awakens and begins to realize how much the noise has numbed you. It's the point at which the soul, tired of noise, begins to crave silence. Carl Jung said that spiritual awakening begins not with enlightenment, but with saturation. You grow weary of the rush, of the automatic speech, of conversations that touch nothing. The self begins to call, and the call comes disguised as exhaustion. You feel a strange fatigue, as if the simple act of existing among people drains your energy. Your body, which once moved to the rhythm of the world, now forces you to stop. Spirituality emerges not as an escape, but as a biological necessity. You realize that being alone is the only way to remain whole. And when silence arrives, it doesn't come as calm. It comes as confrontation. It strips away the veil of everything you pretended to be, and the echo that remains is your own truth, naked and unapplauded. This withdrawal is mistaken for weakness, but it is birth. The world calls loneliness what Jung called the withdrawal of the self. The rational mind tries to explain, you're sad, depressed, distant, but the spiritual body knows. It's metamorphosis. The ego struggles, wants company, wants noise, wants distraction, but the self simply wants space. You begin to realize that talking too much is betraying yourself, that explaining yourself is losing yourself, that exposing yourself is fragmenting yourself. Silence now becomes a magnetic field. Every external sound saps your energy. Every superficial dialogue robs you of oxygen. And the more you try to ignore the call, the more it tears you apart. It's the sacred wound opening its way. Silence at this stage is surgery without anesthesia. It removes everything that is non-essential, and what remains is the essence. You are not isolating yourself. You are being summoned within to the secret room where the self dwells. And it is in this space that everything changes. Silence begins to take on texture. You feel it in the air, on your skin, in the gaps between thoughts. It becomes presence, a field where something greater speaks, but without words. Jung said that silence is the language of the unconscious, and that whoever learns to listen to it is never the same again. Suddenly, time slows down. Things lose importance. What once moved you now seems too small. It is the beginning of individuation, the return to center. And although the world insists you are drifting away from life, you begin to realize that for the first time you are truly alive. Silence reveals what the noise hid. Your soul has always been speaking. You just never stayed still enough to hear. And it is in this moment, between the end of the noise and the beginning of listening, that something even more profound emerges. A voice that comes not from outside, but from within. The self, whispering the beginning of a dialogue that will change everything. When silence sets in, something mysterious begins to happen. The void begins to respond. It's not the mind that speaks. It's something older, vaster, more intimate. The self. And Carl Jung said this is the most important conversation a human being can have. The dialogue between the ego and the self. Between the small and the eternal within. At first, this voice seems subtle, almost inaudible. But the more you listen, the more it becomes a presence. It doesn't speak in phrases, it speaks in symbols, sensations, synchronicities. It's a living language made of coincidences that aren't coincidences. You think of someone, and that person appears. You dream of something, and the next day it manifests. The universe begins to speak to you through the unconscious. It's the self opening a direct channel, asking for your attention. And when you finally hear it, everything that was external begins to seem like noise. You understand that the world doesn't speak to you, it translates you. This dialogue is brutal because the self doesn't praise, it reveals. It shows you where you lie, where you hide, where you still live according to the persona. Jung said that the self is a mirror that reflects without distortion, and whoever looks into it sees both light and shadow. Therefore, listening to this voice is an act of courage. It will show you that much of what you call kindness is fear, that your generosity is sometimes an escape, that your faith is often disguised need. The self doesn't want to punish you, it wants to free you. But to do so, it needs to shatter the false. And that's why silence hurts, because it tears away masks. It destroys the comfort of lies. It is at this point that spirituality ceases to be idealism and becomes alchemy, the inner fire that burns the ego until it becomes transparent. The sacred wound deepens, but it is through it that the light enters. Over time, this conversation becomes your compass. Decisions begin to come from within, not from advice. Intuition becomes more reliable than logic. The self guides you not with certainties, but with signs. It doesn't answer how, only when. It teaches patience, and patience is the gateway to power. You begin to realize that nothing is loss. Everything is a process. What was ripped away was returned to the invisible to teach you detachment. What remains, remains because it is essential. Jung said that dialogue with the self is like a bridge. It connects what you are to what you came to be. And crossing this bridge requires overcoming the fear of the abyss. It's a process of dying without dying, and of being reborn without applause. But when you cross it, something opens up, a new sensitivity, a sharp perception. And with it comes a weight, the weight of feeling everything that others don't. As the dialogue with the self deepens, the world around you begins to feel heavy. Not because people have changed, but because now you feel everything. Carl Jung called this unconscious transmission. The awakened begin to perceive what others can't bear to see. You walk into a room and the air grows heavy. You talk to someone and feel a sadness that isn't yours. They smile at you, but the energy behind the smile hurts. It's as if spiritual awakening transforms you into a living radar of the invisible. You sense what lies beneath the words, what vibrates between the lines, what the silence of others tries to hide. The self has granted you symbolic vision, but with it comes a burden, that of perceiving too much. And the body, now sensitive to the truth, begins to react. fatigue, tension, palpitations, fragmented sleep. It's not illness, it's too much perception for a world anesthetized by too little. This sensitivity is both a gift and a curse. Jung said that the collective unconscious pulsates in everything and the awakened become its antenna. People approach you and feel relief, but they don't know why. It's because they've unloaded on you what they couldn't bear to carry within themselves. They leave feeling lighter and you, exhausted. Empathy at this stage is draining, and that's why solitude becomes sacred. You begin to avoid crowds, shield yourself from noise, prefer silence to conversation, not because you hate people, but because you understand that constant contact contaminates you with other people's unconscious. You then learn to dose your presence like someone dosing medicine. Jung called this psychic strategy, maintaining distance without losing compassion. And this is the most difficult lesson of the awakened, to love without absorbing, to understand without burdening, to be light, but with boundaries. Over time, you understand that this burden is part of the mission. The self didn't give you sensitivity to weaken you, but to make you an instrument. What runs through you isn't just yours, it's collective material crying out for healing. Every anguish you process is a cleansing that reverberates in the human realm. It's invisible work, but essential. Jung said that the awakened become an organ of consciousness of humanity, a living filter between the unconscious and the real. But for this to work, silence is necessary. It's in retreat that you return what isn't yours, transmuting pain into lucidity. Therefore, isolation isn't an escape. It's a recalibration. The self needs space to metabolize chaos. And it's in this empty space, between exhaustion and rest, that something begins to blossom. A fascination with a universe that pulsates within you. An inner world vaster and more real than any landscape out there. When you distance yourself from the external noise, the invisible begins to gain a voice. What was once silence becomes a stage. The self opens its doors and reveals an entire world within you, so real, so vast, so full of life, that the external world begins to seem like a colorless copy. Carl Jung called this active imagination, but the name hardly matters. What matters is the amazement, the realization that there is a symbolic, living, pulsating reality waiting to be explored. Dreams become teachers. Archetypes gain a face, and every sensation begins to contain a message. It's a parallel universe that only the awakened can access, not through privilege, but through courage. Because it takes courage to dive where no one can accompany you. Spirituality ceases to be a concept and becomes a journey. And the deeper you dive, the more the self manifests, sometimes in the form of images, sometimes in the form of intuition, always in the form of truth. In this state, external life begins to lose its luster. Conversations seem shallow, routines mechanical, time irrelevant. Because within you, time doesn't exist. A second can contain 1,000 years. A dream can reveal the meaning of a decade. Jung said that the unconscious is a container and the awakened, an explorer. With each dive, you bring to the surface something sacred, a symbol, an ancestral memory, a new perception of reality. This is why retreat becomes not only necessary, but irresistible. You no longer want to be everywhere. You want to be whole in one place, within. Meditating, writing, creating, contemplating, all of these become spiritual practices, not out of obligation, but out of fascination. The inner world is a temple, and the self is the high priest guiding the rituals of the soul. But this fascination is a double-edged sword. The danger is getting lost in beauty and forgetting integration. The ego, fascinated, wants to take refuge. It wants to live there, far from pain, far from responsibility. But Jung warned, awakening is not an escape inward, it is a return to the world through what has been discovered within. It is necessary to traverse symbolism and return with something concrete: wisdom, compassion, clarity. That is why silence is so important. It is the portal between the two worlds. It teaches you to leave the dream and act, to bring the invisible into the tangible. The fascination with the internal is the prelude to the real work, the moment when you realize that everything you saw within needs to be transformed into life outside. It is the passage between insight and integration, between seeing and living. And it is at this point that true spiritual labor begins, the secret work of consciousness, which operates in silence, out of sight, but close to the soul. Seeing is easy. Integration is what separates the awakened from the distracted. Carl Jung said that there is no enlightenment in imagining figures of light, but rather in making darkness conscious. The secret work of integration begins when you stop seeking new answers and begin digesting those you've already received. It is at this point that awakening ceases to be ecstasy and becomes discipline. Every revelation needs to be processed, every wound needs to be welcomed, every shadow needs to be brought to the table. Individuation is a slow digestion, psychic, emotional, and spiritual. The self silently reorganizes the chaos, but demands your participation. And this participation is painful. It means revisiting what has been forgotten, touching what the ego has buried, reopening what still throbs. Silence becomes a laboratory, the body an instrument, and the sacred wound raw material. It is an invisible but transformative process. The gold of consciousness is born from the mud of experiences you refuse to look at. The work is so intimate that no witness can exist. No one can integrate for you because the soul is non-transferable. Jung called this process the psychology of creative solitude, a state in which you seem absent from the world, but are more alive than ever. People think you've disappeared, and you have, from their perspective, not from you. You're withdrawn within your own soul, transforming pain into direction. It's at this stage that spirituality loses its glamour and gains depth. You understand that healing isn't about erasing the past, but making peace with it. That growing isn't about rising above mistakes, but dancing with them until they lose their power. And most importantly, that self-love isn't about positive affirmation. It's about daily commitment to truth. The self guides, but doesn't carry. It shows the map, but you must cross the desert. And this journey has a cost. The ego will resist because integration kills the character it created. The comfort of masks falls away, and with it comes the feeling of being naked before one's own soul. But it is in this nakedness that authenticity is born. Jung said that the wound is the place where the light enters, and this light does not arrive without pain. Integration is the birth of a new being, silent yet intense. It is at this stage that time becomes distorted. Days seem like years, minutes seem like eternities. You realize that every tear has a purpose, every solitude is a stage, every silence is an initiation. The soul strengthens and the self takes shape. And when the process begins to stabilize, something new happens. You no longer need to be seen because the mirror that defined you dissolves. And at this point, something even more profound begins: the voluntary forgetting of the reflection. There comes a moment when you tire of even observing yourself, tired of the search for approval, the need to be interpreted, the attempt to exist in the eyes of others. This is where the forgetting of the mirror begins. Carl Jung said that the greatest prison of human beings is the gaze of others. Since childhood, we learn to mold ourselves according to the world's reaction. We smile to be accepted. We hide pain to avoid disturbing. We play roles to be loved. But spiritual awakening comes and shatters this mirror. Suddenly you find yourself without a reflection. The persona, accustomed to having an audience, collapses, And it is in this collapse that the self appears, not as an image, but as a presence. You discover that you are not what others see, nor what you tried to appear. You are something that exists even when no one sees. Silence now is your only mirror, and in it there is neither praise nor criticism, only what is. This forgetting is one of the most painful stages of individuation. It's mourning everything you pretended to be. The mind screams, "Who am I if I'm not what others think?" And the self responds, "You are what's left when all this falls away." It's a simple yet devastating answer, because it requires you to give up the psychological security the image provided. The mirror gave you a sense of self, albeit a false one, and without it, there's only emptiness. Jung said that emptiness is the waiting room for a new consciousness. At first, it's uncomfortable. You try to cling to old roles, try to fit into old versions, but nothing fits anymore. And when you finally surrender, magic happens. You feel free, not because everything has improved, but because for the first time, you don't have to prove anything. Spirituality then ceases to be a quest and becomes a state. But the world doesn't like those who free themselves. It will try to rebuild the mirror. It will call you cold, distant, strange, and perhaps you'll doubt for a while, thinking you're wrong for not fitting in. But soon you realize it's not distancing, it's discernment. The soul can no longer tolerate places where it must shrink to fit in. Jung said that individuation is an act of spiritual disobedience, the moment when the being ceases to belong to the collective and begins to belong to its own truth. And that's what forgetting the mirror does. It returns you to your own nature, wild and silent. The ego dies a little, the self breathes. And when this breathing stabilizes, a new rhythm emerges. The original heartbeat of the soul, calling back home, to the origin, to the source where it all began. When the mirror shatters and the reflection fades, what remains is what always existed before any image, the self. Carl Jung said that the return to the source is the moment when the awakened individual stops seeking God outside and begins to feel him pulsing within. It is the stage in which spirituality becomes conscious silence, not as an absence of sound, but as full presence. Nothing more needs to be conquered, because everything already is. The ego, which once made noise, now falls silent before the vastness of what has been remembered. The self is not a concept, it is a state. It needs no form, belief, or religion, because it is the very principle of life, recognizing itself through you. Solitude, which once seemed like separation, now becomes communion. You realize that being alone is being with everything. The wind ceases to be wind, but becomes divine breath, and the simple beating of the heart becomes prayer. But this return is not static, it is movement. Pulsation, the breath of the soul. Jung said that the pre-social being is the being that exists before adaptation. Here, the individual does not need approval, does not need applause, does not need definition. He exists, and that is enough. Individuation at this point fulfills its purpose, to return man to what is natural, wild and sacred. You walk the world again, but differently. What once irritated you now merely passes through you. What once controlled you now teaches you. It is as if the entire universe becomes a mirror of the self, not to reflect you, but to remind you. Mature spirituality does not seek to ascend, it seeks to integrate. It is bringing heaven to earth, the invisible to a simple gesture. It is knowing that each breath is a miracle in disguise, and that silence is the only sound of truth. Still, this return requires vigilance. Because the ego is cunning, it will try to transform even the sacred into performance. It wants to appropriate purity. It wants to label freedom. Therefore, the self calls you back to silence as a constant reminder, don't get lost again. The awakened soul lives in cycles. It dives, returns, dives again. Each journey is a learning experience, each return, purification. Jung said that the self is the psyche's point of gravity, and the more you align with it, the more everything false falls away. This return is a remembrance, not an achievement. You don't become light, you remember that you always were, and when this remembrance stabilizes, something greater reveals itself. The silent mathematics of consciousness, where time bends and growth is measured in depth, not height. Carl Jung said that consciousness has its own laws, subtle, invisible, and immutable. It grows not by accumulation, but by digestion. Each new insight, each spiritual revelation, requires time to become flesh of the soul. It's what he called psychic mathematics, an exact equation between expansion and withdrawal. The more awakened the mind, the more rest the spirit requires. It's a paradoxical calculation because the world teaches the opposite: to rush, to produce, to accumulate. But the self teaches the rhythm of the sacred, to silence, to feel, to process. This is why the awakened withdraw, not out of ego, but out of a physiological need for awareness. The ordinary mind feeds on stimuli, the expanded mind on silence, and silence now becomes the laboratory where the soul deciphers its own formulas. You understand that needing to stop isn't laziness, it's maturity. Chaos slowly organizes itself, like a heart finding its own rhythm. This mathematics is merciless to the superficial. Every time you try to rush the process, consciousness exacts interest in the form of confusion, anxiety, and emptiness. Haste breaks the thread of learning. Jung said that the unconscious is like a river. If you try to push the water, it drags you along. But if you learn to flow, it takes you exactly where you need to go. The time of the self is the time of nature. Patient, cyclical, inevitable. Therefore, retreat is the calculation of growth. An awakened person without solitude is like a body without sleep. It disintegrates. You begin to realize that solitude is not a pause in life. It is the pulse that sustains it. It is in silence that the unconscious decodes what the ego doesn't understand. It is there that the invisible translates into wisdom. With each dive, something reorganizes. With each pause, something matures. The soul, then, learns to breathe in the rhythm of eternity. But this mathematics goes beyond the self. It's cosmic. Consciousness is a collective system, and each individual awakening changes the entire equation of humanity. When an awakened person becomes silent, the noise of the world diminishes. When they integrate, the collective unconscious balances. Each conscious gesture reverberates in silence, healing places where the light has not yet reached. Jung said that the awakened person becomes an organ of consciousness of the whole, a processor of the invisible. Therefore, isolation is not a leak, it is service. The self works through you, using your silence as a bridge. It is there in what no one sees that the world transforms. And when this equation is complete, a new perception emerges. That service is not speech, it is support. Supporting the invisible, the chaotic, the collective. And it is from this point that the final stage arises, the invisible service of the awakened soul, where silence becomes a tool and love, a work that no one applauds, but the entire universe feels. After understanding the mathematics of consciousness, the awakened realize something that changes everything. What they experienced was never just about themselves. Carl Jung said that the awakened individual becomes a living organ of the collective consciousness, a channel between the visible and the invisible. Every shadow you faced, every silence you endured, every pain you traversed in solitude was work for the whole. You weren't just healing yourself, you were processing humanity's unconscious. This is why the solitude of the awakened is so sacred. No one sees, no one understands, but the self works through them. silently purifying the density of the world. This is the invisible service, priesthood without an altar, love without an audience, sacrifice without witnesses. The awakened soul operates in silence, and silence is its form of prayer. What you call isolation, the self calls mission. But this work doesn't bring recognition, it brings exhaustion. The awakened become a filter, and the filter wears out. People seek you out and leave feeling light, but you feel the weight of something you can't name. They don't understand that your presence heals, but also consumes. Jung said that the awakened are the invisible guardians of the human psyche, and their task is arduous, to sustain the light where the collective still sleeps. Therefore, retreat is not a luxury, it is maintenance. The soul needs to cleanse itself of what it has absorbed. It is in the hours of silence that the self recalibrates the instrument, that the body rests, that the mind aligns, that the heart returns to the rhythm of the divine. You understand that serving is not acting, it is sustaining. Sustaining the invisible is bearing the weight no one perceives. It is keeping the thread of consciousness lit, even when the whole world wants to extinguish it. And the most beautiful and brutal thing is that no one will ever thank you. This is the paradox of the awakened. The more they serve, the less the world understands them. But this is how the self operates, in secret, in silence, in sacrifice. You are not rewarded with applause, but with expansion, and expansion sometimes hurts. It is the pain of carrying a consciousness greater than the body, the pain of feeling what the collective cannot yet bear to feel. But it is also the blessing of seeing what no one else sees, of realizing that everything is interconnected, that every healing gesture echoes like a prayer. Jung said that the truly awakened are those who, even tired, continue to hold the invisible thread of humanity. And it is this thread that keeps the world breathing. You have not isolated yourself, you have been summoned. And this call, silent and eternal, is only the prelude to what is about to begin. The loneliness of the awakened is not the absence of life, it is too much presence. You began to see what others still cannot see. And this excess of lucidity hurts. Carl Jung said that no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making darkness conscious. That's what silence does. It doesn't distance you from the world, it just makes you able to see it without getting lost in it. Being awake is walking between two worlds, the visible which pulls you out and the invisible which calls you in. And the balance is delicate, because the soul, once awakened, does not go back to sleep. She just learns to breathe in the right rhythm between chaos and center. So when the silence calls you again, don't resist. Don't try to fill it with voices, tasks, or distractions. Sit with him and listen, because the self does not speak in shouts, it speaks in whispers. And every time you are silent, he is the one who breathes for you. The sacred wound is not meant to be healed, it is meant to be understood. She is the portal through which consciousness enters. And if you have the courage to remain there, motionless, in the midst of pain and silence, you will realize you were never alone. What you called loneliness was always presence. If something inside you has awakened, if this truth has struck you, write it down. Sometimes the comment is just the first step back to the soul.